Chapter 7 Sorrow in a New Land. When in 1492 Columbus, representing the Spanish monarchy, discovered the New World, he set in train the long and bitter international rivalry over colonial possession for which, after 4.5 centuries, no solution has yet been found. Portugal, which had initiated the movement of international expansion, claimed the new territories on the ground that they fell within the scope of a Papal Bull of 1455 authorizing her to reduce to servitude all infidel peoples. The two powers, to avoid controversy, sought arbitration and, as Catholics, turned to the Pope, a natural and logical step in an age when the universal claims of the papacy were still unchallenged by individuals and governments. After carefully sifting the rivals' claim, the Pope issued in 1493 a series of papal bulls which established a line of demarcation between the colonial possessions of the two states. East went to Portugal and the west to Spain. The partition, however, failed to satisfy Portuguese aspirations, and in the subsequent year, the contending parties reached a more satisfactory compromise in the treaties of Tordesillas, which rectified the papal judgment to permit Portuguese ownership of Brazil. The above quote from Edward Williams' neoclassic work Capitalism and Slavery (University of North Carolina Press), first published in 1944, places in focus an international situation that started in the later part of the 15th century that is still alive and with us on the eve of the 21st century. Michael's book, The Columbus Conspiracy, is a well-researched inquiry into this event that changed the world for all times to come. This event set in motion the Atlantic slave trade that made possible the economic rise of Europe and the expansion of the influence and domination of European people throughout most of the world. Christopher Columbus is the best known of a number of Western thugs and murderers who has been presented to the world as a hero and a discoverer. A future examination of his actions will prove that he had no regard for the people he encountered on the islands in the Caribbean, and he did not appreciate their initial friendship toward him and his crew. A fact that is often overlooked is that a large number of the crew of these three vessels of Christopher Columbus were criminals let out of jail to go on this voyage because it was difficult to recruit others because of the apparent danger of such a mission. The following extracts taken from the Journal of the First Voyage of Christopher Columbus, 1492 to 1493, Eric Williams, page 52, clearly indicates his attitude toward the indigenous people of the Caribbean islands and the Africans he had previously met. The Portuguese generally referred to the west coast of Africa as Guinea. It also indicates that Christopher Columbus could have been a participant in the early Portuguese slave trade. Number 50. The Enslavement of the Aboriginal Indians. Journey of the First Voyage of Christopher Columbus, 1492-1493. Friday, the 12th of October. They should be good servants and intelligent, for I observed that they quickly took in what was said to them. Sunday, 14th of October. These people are very simple as regards the use of arms, as your highness will see from the 7 that I caused to be taken, to bring home and learn our language and return, unless your highness shall order them all to be brought to Castile, or to be kept as captives on the same island. For with 50 men, they can all be subjugated and made to do what is required of them. Monday, the 12th of November. Yesterday, a canoe came alongside the ship with 6 youths in it. 5 came on board, and I ordered them to be detained. They are now here. I afterwards sent to a house on the western side of the river and seized 7 women, old and young, and 3 children. I did this because the men would behave better in Spain if they had women of their own land than without them. The following comment is taken from a speech, It's Time We Rethink Our History, by David R. Stedham, at the first celebration of African American culture and history at Stratford High, Nashville, Tennessee, and published in CLC Report, March 1990, pages 6 through 8. When we begin to rethink our history, we understand why history books were wrong. We were all miseducated. Columbus did not discover America. The historical facts: in December 1492, Columbus was totally lost. wandering around the Caribbean islands thinking he was in Asia, when he was discovered by the natives Arawak Americans who lived in these islands. Actually, it was the Arawak ancestors who, 50,000 years before Columbus, discovered the Americas, when they walked across the land bridge in the Bering Strait. Columbus didn't discover anything. He was so confused and lost, he thought he was in India and called the Arawaks Indians. Christopher Columbus was considered a saint by the European who hailed his great so-called discovery. We need to rethink our history. Columbus was no saint, and that the Arawak were not uncivilized savages, like the African who came to America before and after Columbus. These were gentle people with a rich culture who worshiped the one creator. When we begin to rethink our history, we begin to put into a historical perspective the true role of Europeans in our 500-year history. The prosperity, the wealth, the good European lifestyles we enjoy today in America began in 1492. And from its infant beginnings, this prosperity grew out of slavery. You see, slavery did not begin with the importation of African people to America. Slavery in America began with Columbus. The first slaves were not Africans, but Native Americans. Columbus wrote in his journals about the inhabitants of Haiti, present-day Haiti. All the inhabitants could be taken away to Castile, Spain, or made slaves on that island. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. In truth, that is exactly what he did. Columbus enslaved the gentle Arawak Haitians, forced them to give up their gold and their land. After all, he had discovered these riches. They were his for the taking. What is also true is Columbus took hundreds of Arawak slaves to Spain, where they were sold or died. They didn't freely go with Columbus to meet the king, as many history books led us to believe. In his quest for gold, Columbus had the hands cut off of any Arawak who did not bring his or her quota of gold. In a short 40 years, the entire race of people in Haiti, 500,000 Native Americans, were wiped off the face of the earth by Columbus and the Spaniards that followed him. No, Columbus was no saint. We need to rethink our history. Non-European people, especially Africans and the indigenous Americans in the Caribbean islands referred to as Indians, initially attributed to the Europeans a humanity and a spirituality that they did not have, and still do not have in their relationship with most of the non-European people of the world. This was a weakness in dealing with the aggressive Europeans, and to some extent it still is. Christopher Columbus was the forerunner of the European aggressor and land grabber of today. They have justified these actions in this regard in the name of God, using the assumption that people were being brought under the influence of civilization. This indeed was a contradiction, because the act of committing against these people was uncivil. When the people assume that their God approves of their criminal action against another people, they have made God ungodly. In many ways, the Europeans' misuse of religion has destroyed the spirituality that was initially the basis of all religions. The Carib and the Arawak Indians were curious about Christopher Columbus and his crew, and at first treated them as strange and new guests in their homes. They did not know that soon after arrival, the guests would turn to the host and make them slaves. The destruction of the Caribs and Arawaks in the Caribbean islands through disease, rape of their women, and sometimes out-and-out murder destroyed the labor supply on these islands and made it a necessity for the Spaniards and other Europeans to create a rationale for the enslavement of the Africans. In his book, The Disruption of the Indies, Father de las Casas estimates that from 12 to 25 million indigenous Americans were killed on the islands in the Caribbean. The school books that indicate that Christopher Columbus was on a civilizing mission are a disservice to students and teachers who should be in rebellion against them. Christopher Columbus and his crew could have formed a successful partnership with the Indians that would have been to the benefit of both of them. While Christopher Columbus was still prevails as a major hero to the Western world, sometime in the not-too-distant future, if African and Indian scholars who are descendants of those who were murdered start writing books about the opening up of the New World and start using new and old documents, especially the work of Bartolomeo de las Casas, Christopher Columbus would emerge as one of the great villains of human history, which indeed he was. When this revelation becomes apparent to most of the world, I still think there will be a need for Columbus Day, but it will be justifiable day of mourning for the millions of Africans and so-called Indians who died to accommodate the spread of European control over the Americas and Caribbean islands. Christopher Columbus had helped to set in motion the Atlantic slave trade, the greatest single Holocaust in human history. Most modern-day scholars who have a one-dimensional view of history, mostly partial to Europe, are not ready to consider the fact of the pre-Columbian presence of several different national groups before Columbus, going back as far as 1000 BC. Professor Ivan Van Sertima's book that came before Columbus, The African Presence in Ancient America, Random House, New York, 1976, is clear on this subject. The Vikings came in a hurry and obviously left in a hurry. They left evidence of their culture, of their art, and no evidence of their literature. This must have been a culture in transition. The pre-Columbian presence of Orientals in the New World has been alluded to and partly documented in a number of books, such as Ancient Egyptians and Chinese in America by R.A. Jervis, Roman and Littlefield, Satori, New Jersey, 1974. And Columbus was Chinese. Discoveries and Inventions of the Far East by Hans Burr, Herder and Herder, New York, 1972. This early meeting of the Africans, the Orientals, and the Indians were a complementary infusion of culture that today could be a lesson for the whole world, because in all that we have learned in documents, there wasn't even a hint of a war between these cultures and people. This brings us to the conclusion that might be difficult for a lot of people to accept. Maybe the world outside of the Europe didn't need the Europeans in the first place. Maybe in this fakery about spreading civilization, he destroyed more civilization than he ever built and did the world more harm than good. What I learned from reading the literature of this subject is that this early meeting between indigenous Americans and Orientals and Africans was a laboratory in human relationships, because it proved that different people of different cultures and religions and colors can coexist, can complement each other without dominating or attempting to destroy each other. We find the personality of Christopher Columbus and his associate constantly reoccurring in the early part of this drama about the opening of what is referred to as the New World. Little emphasis is placed on the fact that Christopher Columbus wasn't too clear about where he was and knew nothing about the people he met in the lands he allegedly discovered. Instead of being a meeting of cultures and amalgam of cultures complementing each other by infusion, Christopher Columbus set in motion a tragic clash of culture that has not ended to this day. This clash of culture is caused by the arrogant assumption on the part of some Europeans that they are the only people who ever produce anything worthy of be called a culture. The following entry in Christopher Columbus' diary is taken from Documents of West Indies Histories, Volume 1, 1492 through 1655, from the Spanish discovery to the British conquest of Jamaica, edited by Eric Wisdom. Tuesday, the 15th of January, the intercourse at Carib will, however, be difficult because the natives are said to eat human flesh. The admiral determined to go there, as it were on the route, and thence to Martinino, which was said to be entirely peopled by women, without men. He would thus see both islands and take some of the natives. In his early 15th of January, Christopher Columbus infers that some of the people of Puerto Rico are cannibals. This is one of the most persistent myths, coming mainly from Europeans, using it as a rationale to reduce some non-European people to servitude. This charge is often made and rarely proven. Ironically, the charge of cannibalism is more often charged to a people who in their society have more than an adequate supply of non-human meat. Those making the charge generally come from a society that has been historically short of non-human meat. From this deduction, I leave it to the individual reader to arrive at his or her own conclusion. Monday, the 18th of February, he pretended to have gone over more ground to mislead the pilots and marines who pricked off the charts, in order that he might remain master of the route to the Indies, as in fact he did. For none of the others kept an accurate reckoning, so that no one but himself could be sure of the route to the Indies. In his entry of 18th of February, there is a clear indication of deception between Christopher Columbus and his pilots. If he originally set out to go to the East Indies, why did he go to the West Indies? This is why the indigenous people, the Caribs and the Arawaks, are referred to as Indians. This aspect of the Columbus saga begs for investigation over and beyond the Christopher Columbus hero worshippers, who have written a library of books about this complex individual who we still don't not know. In chapter 2 of his book, The Columbus Conspiracy, Michael Bradley goes beyond the personality of Christopher Columbus and deals with the possibility that there were previous explorers in the Americas, such as the Carthaginians and the Phoenicians. In this speculation, Michael Bradley is not only telling us more things that we need not to know about early exploration, he is also telling us about human curiosity in relationship to exploration. In his chapter Echoes of Ancient Truth, Michael Bradley alludes to the late development of the nation-state in Europe and the still slower development of a uniform language and culture that Europeans could understand, one to the other. Today, this would seem like a contradiction because in most textbooks and in the mass media, the European is presented to the world as though he arrived culturally pure and endowed with knowledge and the mandate to lead the world. What Michael Bradley has said in this chapter is that Europeans, like all other people in the world, had to endure a long and hard struggle before arriving at a state and a condition that could justify what is being called civilization. Europeans lack an understanding of most of the people of the world, mainly because they lack an understanding of themselves. In the previous chapter of this book, Michael Bradley takes up a more dangerous issue. The issue deals with the possible Jewish input into New World discovery and the medieval roots of international religion conflicts in Europe affecting a segment of the Jewish population who might have disguised themselves as Catholics. He alludes to some misconception we might still have about the personality of Jesus Christ, his early life, and his relationship to the Jewish people of biblical times. This chapter has both topical and historical roots, putting on the agenda for discussion some little-known aspects of the Christian story and its relationship to the role of the Jewish people in world history. This chapter, carefully read, might start debates, fist fights in some places, and it might also cause the author, Michael Bradley, to seek a hiding place. Mr. Bradley alludes to the assumption that the royal house of France could have been Jewish and that the Jewish bloodline came into Europe in this matter. This information, while generally unknown, has been known and debated by a select group of scholars for the last 40 years. I am of the opinion that these scholars think that people beyond their academic circle are not intelligent enough to understand the truth about history. Michael Bradley had dared to put some forbidden subjects on the agenda for discussion. He has rendered a service that he will not be universally thanked for, but it is a service nonetheless. After reading this chapter, I strongly suggest the reading of two very neglected works by Professor Alan Boyd Kuhn, who is the King of Glory, in my opinion one of the clearest books written on the Christ story, and Shadow of the Third Century, another ably written book about the early rise of Christianity. He concludes the chapter with the statement that Columbus seems to have been born of a heretical family. The points that I have been alluding to are summarized by Michael Bradley at the close of chapter 3. Godfrey de Bouillon wanted to create a new Jerusalem in the Holy Land, where the three great faiths of the West could be reconciled. He failed, but this sort of crusade is what apparently motivated Christopher Columbus and his supporters and financial backers. His voyage may have been a crusade to establish a new Jerusalem in a new world, and I think this is the light in which we should view his motivations. It is also a perspective and a light that will permit some insight into the anomalous fact and unlikely coincidence of his life. He seems to have been part of an ancient noble conspiracy to create a world of religion toleration between Jew, Christian, and Muslim. A new Jerusalem. That, I think, was Columbus' concept of a crusade and the only worthwhile kind of crusade. Attempts to unravel the Columbus mystery have not been left to only a few scholars. There has long been debates and some serious questions raised in academic circles without an appreciation public attention being raised. African American scholars such as J.A. Rogers, Carter G. Woodson, and William Leo Hansberry have raised this question in their works. In an essay, The Origin of Racism in the Americas, by the Caribbean writer Jan Carew, in the book African Themes, Northwestern University Studies in honor of Gwendolyn M. Carter, Iron Abu-Lugood, editor of Programs of African Studies, Northwestern University, Evanston, Illinois, 1977, page 3. He infers that Columbus' exploration to the New World was the possible origin of a present-day racism. His statement is as follows. It is extraordinary that in the 482 years since the Arawakan Lucayas of San Salvador discovered Columbus and his sailors on their beaches, so little research has been done on the origin of racism in the New World. This paucity of research is all the more astonishing when one considers that patterns of race relations and systems of caste, color, and class have not changed a great deal in the 4 3/4 centuries of the Columbian era. But before examining the subject of racism in the New World in Columbian times, we should consider briefly two important early visits to the New World. Number one, 5 centuries before Columbus, Norsemen sailed to Greenland, Labrador, and points south of the St. Lawrence Estuary. And 2, in pre-Columbian times, Africans visited the Americas. Most notable expedition taking place. Arab chronicles tell us in 1310 when the Emperor of Mali, determined to extend his empire beyond the western reaches of its Atlantic shores, sailed with 400 ships to the New World. The salary precursor of both Columbus and the African slave had a distant bearing on subsequent events and played a significant role in laying the foundation of new civilizations in the Americas. In chapter 5 of his book, Michael Bradley maintains that there could have been 2 Columbuses, one being a master pirate of French descent, the other being the Christopher Columbus of history. He points to the document that made him arrive at his conclusion and the circumstances that tend to prove that the truth of his conclusion is at least a possibility. In chapter 6, Michael Bradley again alludes to the possible Jewish origins of Christopher Columbus and that the purpose of his voyage had a mission extending beyond discovery and the search for gold. He points to some evidence that tends to indicate a religious meaning for the voyage that is rooted in some of the conflicts and mysteries around the origin of Christianity. Michael Bradley has put on the agenda a subject that might start another crusade, a crusade to kill Michael Bradley in order to shut him up. To fully understand Michael Bradley's book, it might be necessary to go away from the massive information in the book, new and old, and look at the period in European history from 1400 through 1600. After the Crusades and the period of plagues and famines, Europe had lost 1/3 of its population. The Africans and the Arabs, who had been controlling Spain in the Mediterranean since the year 711, were still in control, though that control had begun to weaken. Europeans were short on food and the ability to preserve food. They wanted and needed access to the spices, sweets, and preservatives of Asia in order to continue to survive. This is the period when some of the conflict between the various factions of the Catholic Church was settled by the marriage of Queen Isabella and Ferdinand of Spain. It was also the period when Spain regained her sovereignty and drove out her Arab and African colonial masters, collectively called Moors. The Spanish were looking for ethnic and religious purity and therefore expelled the Jews along with the Arabs and the Africans of Muslim faith. This was not only a turning point in the history of Europe, it was a major turning point in the history of the world. This period not only saw the rise of the Atlantic slave trade and the European colonization of most of the world. Europeans subsequently began to colonize information about this history of the world. They colonized complementary images and began to infer that whiteness was the image of goodness. The most tragic aspect of their colonization of image was their colonization of the image of God and the characters in the Bible. This is the period when the Europeans began to infer that the world was waiting in darkness for Europeans to bring the light. This book has both a historical and topical meaning that is still very much with us. Totally aside from opening up the Caribbean islands, North and South America for European exploration, Christopher Columbus had set in motion the rationale for the destruction of an indigenous population that he mistakenly referred to as Indians. He had simulated the Atlantic slave trade. The Africans were used as a rationale to replace the rapidly disappearing Indian.